Hold your hand out in front of you. Feel the warmth radiating off your skin. That warmth is something you probably take for granted. Furnaces, insulation, double-paned windows. But imagine trying to sleep through a winter night in a building made of wood, paper, and stone. No heating system, no insulation, just you and the cold. That was the reality for everyone who lived inside a Japanese castle. Feudal lords, samurai, servants. Entire households of people sleeping in structures that were designed, first and foremost, to survive summers, not winters. And the winters in much of Japan are brutal. If you are settling in for the night, this is a good one. We're going to explore something that most history channels skip entirely. Not the battles, not the politics, but the simple, deeply human question of how people actually slept in these extraordinary buildings when temperatures dropped below freezing. Subscribe and stick around to understand why sleeping in a Japanese castle during winter was such a challenge. You need to understand how these buildings were constructed. Japanese architecture, going back centuries, was built for summer. That was the priority. Hot, humid summers that could rot wood, breed mold, and make life unbearable indoors. So Japanese builders did something clever. They made their structures breathable. Sliding doors made of paper called shuji could be opened or removed entirely, turning a room into an open-air pavilion. Walls were thin. Floors were raised off the ground to allow air circulation underneath. The entire design philosophy was ventilation. This worked beautifully in July. A breeze could move through the entire building without obstruction. The raised wooden floors stayed cooler than the earth. The paper screens filtered harsh sunlight into something soft and diffused. It was elegant engineering for a specific problem, but in January, that same design became a liability. All those features that kept the house cool in summer now let the cold pour in from every direction. The paper walls that filtered sunlight so beautifully offered almost no insulation. Wind cut through gaps in the wooden shutters. The raised floors that stayed cool in summer became freezing platforms, suspended in cold air. An American educator named Alice Mabel Bacon, who taught in Japan in the 1890s, described what this was like. She wrote that her paper wall dining room was uncomfortably cold and that the only heating was a small charcoal brazier. 2 entire walls of her room were made of sliding paper screens opening to the outdoors. She could either close the wooden shutters and sit in darkness, or keep them open and freeze. Water left in a cup overnight would be frozen solid by morning inside the house. That wasn't unusual. That was just winter in a traditional Japanese building. And if that was true for a relatively modest home, imagine what it was like inside a castle. Japanese castles were impressive structures. Some rose 5 or 6 stories tall. Matsumoto Castle in Nagano Prefecture, known as the Crow Castle for its black exterior, still stands today with its original wooden interior dating to the 1590s. Nagano sits in the Japanese Alps. Winter temperatures regularly drop well below freezing. Snow piles up on the castle grounds for months. Now here is the thing. The daimyo, the feudal lord, didn't actually live in the main tower most of the time. The tower, or tenshu, was primarily a defensive structure and storehouse. The lord and his family lived in a separate group of single-story buildings called the Goten, or palace, located nearby within the castle compound. But these residential buildings were constructed in exactly the same style: wood, paper, and tatami. The castle compound was a small city in itself. The daimyo's family occupied the innermost area. Samurai of higher rank lived closer to the lord. Lower-ranking warriors and servants were pushed to the outer sections. Everyone, from the most powerful lord to the lowest servant, faced the same fundamental problem when night fell in winter. How do you sleep when the temperature inside your room is essentially the same as the temperature outside? The Japanese answer to this question was fundamentally different from the European approach. In medieval Europe, the goal was to heat the room, build a massive fireplace, burn enormous logs, warm the stone walls, fill the space with heat. The Japanese approach was the opposite. Don't try to heat the space. Heat the person. This philosophy shaped every heating device that Japanese culture produced, and the most important of these was the orori, the sunken hearth. The orori was a square pit cut into the floor, lined with stone, and filled with sand and ash. Charcoal or wood burned at its center. An iron hook descended from the ceiling, holding a kettle of water that provided both hot tea and a touch of humidity. The orori was the heart of every traditional Japanese household. Families gathered around it to eat, talk, work, and dry their clothes. A wooden rack called a haidana hung from the ceiling above it, used to dry rain gear and preserve food in the smoke. The orori provided heat, light, cooking fire, and a gathering point all in one. In the coldest months, many families simply slept around it rather than retreating to unheated bedrooms. But there was a problem with the orori, especially in castle architecture. It was an open fire in a wooden building with paper walls and straw mat floors. Japanese castles were terrifyingly flammable. Fire was the single greatest threat to these structures. More castles were lost to accidental fires than to enemy attack, so open flames had to be carefully controlled. This is where the hibachi came in. The hibachi was a portable charcoal brazier, not the large grills that Americans associate with the word today. These were small vessels, usually ceramic or metal, filled with ash and a few pieces of burning charcoal. They could be carried from room to room. They produced heat without open flames, and they were used everywhere in castle life. Among the nobility and samurai class, hibachi became objects of beauty. Elaborately decorated ceramic braziers and metalwork pieces were created. But no matter how beautiful they were, they had a fundamental limitation. A hibachi could warm your hands if you held them directly over it. It could take the edge off the chill in a small area immediately around it. But it could not heat a room. Think about that. You are a feudal lord in a castle in the mountains of central Japan. It is January. The temperature outside is well below freezing. The temperature inside your room is maybe a few degrees warmer, if that. Your walls are paper, your floor is straw matting over wood, and your primary heat source is a bowl of charcoal that warms approximately the area of a dinner plate. So how did people actually get to sleep? The answer begins with bedding. And Japanese bedding was nothing like what you sleep on tonight. The futon, as the Japanese know it, is not the thick sofa bed you might picture from a Western furniture store. A traditional shikibuton, the mattress portion, was a thin pad of cotton batting laid directly on the tatami floor. Maybe 5 to 8 centimeters thick, barely 2 to 3 inches. On top of the sleeper went the cakebuton, a cotton-filled quilt. And here is the important detail. For most of Japanese history, cotton was expensive. Padded futons were a luxury that only the wealthy could afford. Common people slept on straw mats and covered themselves with whatever clothing they could layer on. Even samurai of modest rank might not have had what we would recognize as proper bedding, but in the castle, among the lord's household, sleeping arrangements were more elaborate. And one of the most fascinating pieces of bedding was something called a kaimaki, or yogi. Picture a giant kimono. Literally, the kaimaki was a thick cotton, stuffed garment shaped like an enormous robe. You didn't put a blanket over yourself. You wore your blanket. The sleeves of the kaimaki were spread out on either side of the body while sleeping. They acted like flaps that prevented the covering from shifting and letting cold air in. The entire design trapped body heat inside the garment. It was like sleeping inside a wearable sleeping bag, shaped to the human form, centuries before modern sleeping bags existed. The kaimaki evolved over centuries. Eventually, the sleeves were removed, and the garment transformed into the rectangular cakebuton quilt that Japanese people still use today. But during the castle period, the kimono-shaped version was standard, and for good reason, in a room with no heating. Every possible way to prevent heat loss mattered. And then there was the utanpo, the hot water bottle. This is one of those simple inventions that change daily life in ways that rarely make it into history books. The utanpo was a container, originally ceramic, later metal, filled with hot water. It was wrapped in cloth and placed inside the futon bedding near the sleeper's feet, preheating the bed before the sleeper got in. Records show that the utanpo was known in Japan by at least the 1480s during the Muromachi period. That is the same era when the precursor to the kotatsu was being developed. The principle was the same with both devices. You can't heat the room, but you can create a small pocket of warmth right where it matters most. The kotatsu. If you've ever seen Japanese television or anime set in winter, you've seen one. It is a low table with a heat source underneath and a heavy blanket draped over the frame, trapping warmth in the space beneath. You sit with your legs tucked under the blanket, and the heat rises through your traditional robes, warming your entire body. The kotatsu originated in the 14th century during the Muromachi period. Its earliest form was called a hori-gotatsu. A wooden platform was placed over the irori hearth, and a quilt was draped over the top. The charcoal from the hearth heated the space beneath the platform, and the quilt trapped that heat. Families sat around it for hours. In many households, The kotatsu was where everyone slept too. But here is the thing. Both the irori and the kotatsu had a serious limitation in castle settings. Carbon monoxide burning charcoal in an enclosed space produces the gas, and it can kill silently. Traditional Japanese homes dealt with this through their inherent draftiness. The same gaps that let cold air in also let poisonous gases out. But this was a real danger, and it shaped how heating could be used in sleeping areas. In the sleeping quarters of a castle, servants would prepare the room for the night in a careful sequence. The thick wooden storm shutters, called amado, would be slid closed along their tracks, sealing the room from wind. The futon bedding would be laid out on the tatami. Hibachi braziers would be lit and placed strategically, and the yutanpo would be filled and tucked into the bedding, but the charcoal would be allowed to burn down before sleep. You didn't leave active heat sources burning unattended through the night. The fire risk was too great, and the carbon monoxide risk was real, so by the time the lord actually lay down to sleep, whatever warmth the room had accumulated was already beginning to fade. This meant that the critical hours of sleep were spent in a room that was cooling steadily toward outdoor temperatures. The sleeper's only protection was the insulating quality of the bedding itself, the lingering warmth of the yutanpo at their feet, and the layers of clothing they wore to bed. Because in feudal Japan, you didn't change into pajamas. There was no concept of sleepwear as a separate category of clothing until much later. You slept in your kimono, and in winter, that meant sleeping in multiple layers of wadded cotton kimono, one over another, creating your own portable insulation system. The aristocracy had access to silk, which is an excellent insulator for its weight, but even silk couldn't match the warmth of thick cotton wadding. And cotton, when it finally became widely available during the Edo period in the 17th century, transformed winter sleeping for the Japanese. Before that, commoners and lower-ranking samurai made do with hemp and bast fiber filling, which provided much less insulation. Think about what that means. Before the 17th century, the majority of people sleeping in a Japanese castle didn't have cotton bedding at all. They had covers stuffed with plant fibers that compressed flat after a few uses and provided almost no thermal protection. The difference between a cotton-stuffed kaimaki and a hemp-filled cover in a freezing room wasn't just about comfort. It was the difference between sleep and a night of shivering wakefulness. Cotton changed everything. When cotton cultivation expanded across Japan during the Edo period, the material became accessible to the merchant class and eventually to common households. Suddenly, families who had spent generations sleeping under thin hemp covers could afford the kind of warm, lofted bedding that had previously been reserved for the aristocracy. It was one of the quiet revolutions that transformed Japanese daily life. Now, there was another dimension to sleeping in a castle that had nothing to do with temperature. Security. A daimyo was a powerful man with powerful enemies. Assassination was a real and constant threat, and the hours of darkness, when the lord lay sleeping, were the most vulnerable time of all. This is where Japanese castle architecture reveals something genuinely ingenious. Some of the most famous castles including Nijo Castle in Kyoto, built in 1603 as the official residence of the first Tokugawa shogun, were equipped with what are called nightingale floors. In Japanese, Ugizu Bari. Bush warbler, guard watch. The concept was elegant. Floorboards were laid atop supporting beams, but not rigidly. Metal clamps were installed between the boards and the beams. When anyone stepped on the floor, the boards shifted slightly, causing the clamps to rub against iron nails. The result was a distinct chirping sound, like a bird singing. Every footstep announced itself. You could not sneak across a nightingale floor. It was impossible. Even the lightest step produced a clear, audible chirp that would carry through the quiet rooms of a sleeping castle. For a ninja or assassin trying to reach a sleeping lord, these floors were a devastating obstacle. Your approach was announced with every single step, and the castle guards had their own countermeasure to prevent confusion. They walked in a specific, designated rhythm. If the nightingale floors chirped in that familiar pattern, everyone knew it was a friendly patrol. If the chirping came in an unfamiliar rhythm or at an unexpected time, that meant someone uninvited was moving through the corridors. The alarm would be raised. Think about what that means for the sleeping experience. You are the daimyo. You are lying on your futon in a freezing room, wearing multiple layers of clothing under heavy quilted bedding with a cooling utanpo at your feet. The wooden shutters are closed against the wind, and all around you, the floors are designed to sing if anyone approaches, but there was an additional layer of protection. In many castles, hidden rooms were built adjacent to the lord's sleeping quarters. These were concealed behind panels or beneath floors, and personal bodyguards would lie in wait in these spaces throughout the night, ready to emerge at a moment's notice if the nightingale floors raised the alarm. So the picture that emerges is not one of a lord sleeping peacefully through a quiet winter night. It is one of an entire household engaged in an elaborate ritual of survival against the cold, survival against potential attack. Every detail of the sleeping arrangements, from the bedding to the floor construction to the placement of guards, was part of a system designed to get everyone through the night alive. If you are drifting off right now, that is fine. The castle's been standing for centuries. It'll be here in the morning. Let's talk about what the servants experienced. Because while the lord had the best bedding, the finest clothing, and personal bodyguards, the people who actually made the castle function had a much harder time of it. Lower-ranking samurai and servants often slept in the outer buildings of the castle compound, farther from the center and more exposed to the elements. Their quarters were smaller and less protected. They might have thinner bedding, fewer layers of clothing, and no personal heating devices. In the worst cases, foot soldiers, quartered in barracks-style buildings, slept shoulder to shoulder for shared body warmth. The ashigaru, or foot soldiers, who formed the bulk of any castle's garrison, lived in cramped quarters that made the lord's chambers look luxurious by comparison. In some castle towns, these soldiers were housed in long tenement buildings called nagaya, with families packed into small divided spaces. But in the Kaga domain, centered on Kanazawa Castle, Ashigaru families were given detached houses, which was considered remarkably generous. Whether in a tenement or a small house, the sleeping arrangement was the same. Gather around whatever heat source was available. Layer on every piece of clothing and bedding you owned. And wait for dawn. Children slept closest to the heat source. Adults formed a protective ring around them, their bodies acting as additional insulation between the children and the cold walls. In the smallest quarters, a family of 4 or 5 might sleep in a space barely large enough for 2 people to lie down. Privacy was a luxury that cold weather erased. Warmth was shared because it had to be. Now, one of the most remarkable things about the Japanese approach to winter was how it influenced the entire rhythm of daily life in a castle. Bathing, for instance. Japanese bathing culture is ancient and deeply important. Even in the castle period, hot baths were considered essential. But water had to be heated over fire, carried to the bathing area, and used before it cooled. In winter, the journey from a warm bath to an unheated room was a shock that everyone dreaded. Some daimyo had the luxury of hot spring access near their castles. The lords of Matsumoto Castle frequented the Asama Onsen, a hot spring area just a short distance away, which had served as the castle lord's personal bathing retreat. Soaking in naturally heated mineral water, surrounded by snow, was one of the few genuinely warm experiences available in a Japanese winter. And it happened outside the castle, not inside it. The contrast must have been extraordinary. Your body submerged in water heated by volcanic forces deep beneath the earth. Your face exposed to air cold enough to turn your breath into clouds. Steam rising from the surface and disappearing into the night sky. And then the inevitable moment when you had to get out, dry off, dress, and make the journey back to your unheated quarters. Japanese poetry from the castle period is full of references to this experience. The shock of cold after warmth, the reluctance to leave the bath, the speed at which the body's heat dissipated once exposed to winter air. It was a daily reminder that warmth in feudal Japan was always temporary, always something you had to actively seek and would inevitably lose. But here is the thing that might surprise you most. The Japanese didn't view their cold houses as a problem to be solved. Not exactly. There was a philosophy embedded in the architecture, one that persists to this day, that the proper approach to cold weather is to dress warmly and heat yourself, not to heat the empty air in a room. This philosophy shows up in a concept that Japanese people still reference: warm the person, not the space. It is why even modern Japanese homes, despite having access to every heating technology available, often lack central heating. Individual rooms are heated when occupied. The hallways are cold. The bathroom is cold. You dress warmly, move between heated zones, and accept that the house itself will be cold. And this brings us back to the castle, because when you understand this philosophy, the sleeping arrangements start to make more sense. The futon on the tatami wasn't a compromise. It was the system working as intended. Your body generates heat. The bedding traps it. The clothing insulates it. The Utanpo gives you a head start. And by morning, you've created a warm cocoon in the middle of a freezing room without wasting any energy heating air that nobody occupies. There is an old Japanese saying that captures this idea: Zukan Sokunetsu, head cool, feet warm. The belief was that good health and good sleep came from keeping the extremities warm while the head remained cool. The Utanpo at the feet, the kaimaki covering the body, the firm buckwheat pillow keeping the head slightly elevated and cool. It was a complete sleep system designed around a specific understanding of the body, and this system wasn't just for one night. Castle life in winter followed this pattern for months. From November through March in the mountain regions, the cold was relentless. The castle household developed routines that revolved around managing warmth as carefully as they managed food stores or military readiness. Charcoal was a precious resource. It had to be produced during warmer months, stored carefully, and rationed through the winter. The amount of charcoal allocated to different parts of the castle reflected the strict social hierarchy of feudal Japan. The lord's quarters received the most. The servants' quarters received the least. The difference between comfort and suffering could be measured in handfuls of charcoal, and wood was even more stratified. In the castle household, the family irori burned wood, which was cheaper but smokier. The guest irori used charcoal, which was more expensive but produced less smoke and was considered more refined. If you were an honored visitor to a castle in winter, you could judge your status by what burned in your room's heating vessels. Now, there is one more aspect of castle sleeping that deserves attention: the tatami mat itself. These woven rush grass mats, fitted tightly together to cover the floor, were more than just flooring. Tatami has insulating properties. The compressed rice straw core traps air, creating a barrier between the sleeper and the cold wooden subfloor. A tatami mat can absorb and release up to half a liter of moisture, helping regulate humidity around the sleeping area. This is why the futon was laid directly on the tatami and not on the bare wood. The tatami provided a critical thermal break. Without it, the cold from the raised wooden floor would have conducted directly into the sleeper's body. With it, there was at least a thin layer of insulation between person and environment. In the castle context, tatami was a luxury. Not every room had it. Lower-ranking quarters might have bare wood floors, which meant an even colder sleeping surface. The entire castle sleeping experience existed along a spectrum of privilege. At the top, the daimyo had full tatami flooring, thick cotton futon bedding, silk-lined kamaki covers, ceramic utanpo, multiple hibachi braziers, charcoal for guest, quality heating, and armed bodyguards in hidden rooms to ensure he lived to see morning. At the bottom, an ashigaru foot soldier might have a thin straw mat on a wooden floor. A worn cotton cover shared body heat from the soldiers sleeping on either side of him, and the hope that the castle walls would at least block the wind. Same castle, same winter, very different nights. And this is where the mystery deepens. Because despite these conditions, despite rooms that froze water overnight and buildings that offered almost no thermal protection, the Japanese castle system functioned for centuries. People didn't just survive these winters, they built sophisticated cultures around them. Poetry about winter, tea ceremony adapted for cold rooms, the aesthetic of frost on paper screens, the sound of snow sliding from a curved roof in the night. There was beauty in the cold. The Japanese found it, or perhaps created it. The concept of wabi-sabi, finding beauty in imperfection and impermanence, extended to winter itself, a frozen garden seen through a paper screen, the warmth of tea cupped in cold hands, the intimacy of family huddled around a kotatsu while snow fell outside. These weren't just coping mechanisms. They became central pillars of Japanese aesthetic philosophy. The kotatsu is perhaps the purest expression of this. By the Edo period, it had evolved from its origins over the Aurori hearth into a portable table with a charcoal brazier beneath it and a heavy blanket draped over the frame. Families gathered under it for hours. They ate. They talked. They fell asleep. The kotatsu became the center of winter life. Not just a heating device, but a social institution. Modern surveys show that well into the 21st century, roughly 2/3 of Japanese households owned a kotatsu. The charcoal has been replaced by electric heaters. The blankets are thinner and more decorative. But the principle remains unchanged from the 1400s. Create a small pocket of warmth. Gather the people you care about inside it. Let the rest of the world be cold. Now picture this scene again, but centuries earlier, inside a castle. Winter wind howling outside the wooden shutters. The nightingale floors silent, meaning no one is moving through the corridors. The Lord's bodyguards lying awake in their hidden rooms. The charcoal in the hibachi almost burned to ash. And the Lord himself, wrapped in layers of silk and cotton, his feet against a cooling utanpo, drifting between sleep and wakefulness in a room that might be 2 or 3 degrees above freezing. He would wake before dawn. A servant who had risen even earlier in the colder outer quarters would relight the charcoal. Hot water would be prepared. The wooden shutters would be slid open along their tracks, letting in the grey winter light and a blast of cold air. And the castle would stir back to life for another day of governance, military readiness, and the endless management of a feudal domain. There is something worth noting about the Japanese relationship with cold that goes beyond architecture or technology. Throughout Japanese history, endurance of discomfort was considered a virtue. Samurai training emphasized tolerance of heat and cold. The ability to sit in a freezing room without complaint, to sleep on a hard floor without visible discomfort, was seen as evidence of mental discipline and moral character. This cultural attitude shaped how castle inhabitants responded to their conditions. You didn't complain about the cold, you endured it. You found beauty in it, you wrote poetry about it, and you developed an incredibly sophisticated set of technologies and practices to manage it without ever fully conquering it. The Menyoshu, Japan's oldest collection of poetry dating back to the 8th century, contains verses about winter that reveal this attitude. Poets wrote about the cold not as something to be defeated, but as something to be experienced. The beauty of frost on bare branches, the intimacy of shared warmth between lovers on a freezing night, the quiet of a world buried in snow. One persistent theme across centuries of Japanese winter poetry is the warmth of another person before cotton bedding, before the kotatsu, before the yutanpo. There was the simplest and oldest heating technology of all, the body heat of the person sleeping beside you. Poets wrote about this with a tenderness that makes clear just how cold the nights were and how much human warmth mattered, because that is the fundamental insight of Japanese winter architecture. It was never about conquering the cold. It was about living with it, creating small islands of warmth in an ocean of cold. Moving between those islands, accepting that some parts of your world would simply be cold, and finding not just survival, but meaning and beauty in that acceptance. If you are still with us, thank you. If you are drifting off, that is fine too. These castles have been standing through 400 winters now. They'll wait until morning. When modern visitors tour Matsumoto Castle in winter, they're asked to remove their shoes at the entrance. They walk through the original wooden interior in socks, and even on a mild winter day, visitors report that the castle interior is bitterly cold. The steep wooden staircases are slippery. The wind finds its way through every crack and joint, and for a few minutes, standing on those cold wooden floors, looking out through the same narrow windows that samurai once watched through for approaching enemies, you can feel it. Just a fraction of what a winter night in this building must have been like. The cold coming up through the floor, the wind cutting through the walls, the impossible thickness of the darkness before electric light. Then you put your shoes back on, step outside, and get into a heated car, and the experience is over. But for the people who lived in these buildings, there was no heated car. There was no escape from the cold until spring came. And here is something that makes this all the more remarkable to consider. Most of Japan's castles are gone. Nearly 2,000 were destroyed during the Meiji Restoration in the 1860s and 70s, torn down as symbols of the old feudal order. More were lost to bombing during the Second World War. Of the thousands that once dotted the Japanese landscape, only 12 retain their original wooden keeps today. When those castles fell, the knowledge of how people actually lived in them nearly vanished too. The daily rhythms of heating and sleeping and enduring the cold, the precise rituals of preparing a lord's bedchamber, the specific amounts of charcoal allocated to each rank. These details survived mostly in written records, architectural studies, and the living traditions that continue in Japanese homes to this day. The futon on the tatami, the kotatsu in the living room, the ceramic yutanpo filled before bed. These aren't just products, they're fossils of survival, living evidence of centuries of people figuring out, night after night, how to sleep through the cold in buildings that were never designed for winter. And roughly 40% of Japanese people still sleep on futons today. Not because they can't afford beds, but because the system works. It always worked. A thin mattress on tatami, a heavy quilt on top, the body's own heat trapped and reflected back. 400 years of refinement produced something that modern engineering hasn't meaningfully improved upon. The Japanese castle is often presented as a monument to military engineering and political power. And it was those things. But it was also a stage for one of humanity's oldest dramas. The struggle to stay warm through the night, to protect yourself and your family from the cold, to find comfort in a world that offered very little of it, and to wake up in the morning and do it all again. Next time you pull your blanket a little tighter on a cold night, think about this. Every technology between you and the freezing air represents centuries of human problem solving. Insulation, central heating, thermostats, double-paned glass. You are the beneficiary of thousands of years of people who lay awake in the cold. There has to be a better way. The people in those Japanese castles found their way. It wasn't the same way we found ours, but it was remarkable, intimate, beautiful, and in its own way, something we've lost. The warmth of a kotatsu shared with family, the ritual of preparing the futon, the utanpo tucked at your feet, the sound of the nightingale floors telling you that all is well, that no one unwelcome is coming through the dark corridors tonight, that you can close your eyes. Good night, and if you are still awake, subscribe and stick around. There is always another mystery waiting.